Hi, this is Emerald and welcome to the Diamond Net, and today I'm going to be talking to you about integrating the opposites within. So this video is all about an internal schism of opposites and finding ways to integrate them. So we have these opposites within, and it's our ability to hold space for both of those opposites at once within our personality that enables us to have an integrative experience of whatever that aspect of ourself is. But what usually happens when we get into this either-or space of identifying with one and disidentifying with the other in a polarity is that we end up with this one side of that polarity really possessing the identity and the other part getting pushed back in the shadow, where of course all kinds of neuroses and unhealthy coping mechanisms come into play. Now, some examples of these opposites would be codependency and narcissism, creativity and pragmatism, or in a more general sense, good and bad. And again, good and bad comes from our relative definition of that. So we can stick anything in the good pile and anything in the bad pile. And we can just hyper-identify with whatever the qualities are in the good pile and disidentify with whatever qualities are in the bad pile. So this is one of the main reasons why these internal schisms of opposites happen, because we identify one part of that polarity as good and one part of that polarity as bad or undesirable in some way. And so we end up in this tug of war with ourselves where we're really grasping for one half of a polarity and we're really pushing away the other half of that polarity. But the thing we have to understand is that all polarities happen on a spectrum within the self, and that's true regardless of what polarity it is. And so we all have a natural set point in our personality along every spectrum. And whenever we are centered in our natural set point along the spectrum, things flow a lot more easily. Things come into alignment. But whenever we have these schisms where we polarize ourselves in that way and push away one aspect of a polarity, it gets us out of our natural energy and our natural set point, and it creates a lot of issues. So the way to understand our natural set point along any given spectrum, and there are many spectrums, is that you want to think about it like your DNA or like a seed. It is an inherent part to your nature that is inborn. We tend to, as a society, have this notion that all personality comes from conditioning, and that if we didn't have conditioning, we would be complete tabula rasa. But this is not actually true. The rhythm of our personality, the way that we are, the things that we generally resonate with is already there. It's sort of like if you have a tulip seed, that tulip seed is never going to grow a geranium or a rose. It will only ever grow a tulip. Now, when we have these internal schisms of opposites and we have a lot of things separating ourselves from our nature and from our natural energy, what happens is we start to grow an unhealthy tulip, a tulip that never quite thrives, but maybe survives a little bit. But if you want a tulip that actually thrives, like the best tulip that you can be, what you want is you want to have integration between all aspects within the personality, including with these internal schisms of opposites that are very, can be difficult for people to really disidentify with one pole enough to hold space for both. And once you're actually able to hold space for the opposites within relative to any given spectrum, you naturally find your set point on that spectrum. You naturally find where your self is. You find yourself. And in this way, it's not like you ever have to force anything together. It's like if you remove the barrier and you remove the hyper-identification with one polarity and the hyper-disidentification with the other polarity, what happens is that you naturally find your center, which can be at any point along that spectrum. And once you've found your natural set point relative to all dichotomies, what happens is that all of these aspects of the personality naturally fall into alignment. And when that happens, you don't get this splintered off internal relationship with the self, where from the subconscious, one part's pulling you in this direction and the other part's pulling you in this direction, and there's a lot of lack of clarity and neuroses that come from that. What happens when you have these integrations is that they naturally come into alignment and your life starts to flow with more ease because you know which direction you actually want to go in, and all of your energy can be focused in that direction. So to give a metaphor, whenever we have this polarization that happens and we hyper-identify with one side to the expense of the other, it sort of creates a kink in our hose. It makes it to where the water can't flow out through the hose properly, and it creates this contents under pressure situation where the water pressure is greatly diminished. It scatters our energy. But whenever we have that alignment, it's like that entire hose just opens up and the water can flow forward in one given direction without obstruction and with its full strength and potency. Now, when it comes to understanding these oppositional schisms, you have to understand that it's not just a spectrum of traits that we're talking about. It's really an aspect of the self which has its own needs and wants and fears and perspective and memories and wisdom. So in this way, you can think of this internal schism of opposites as being like two individual selves within you. So the one that you hyper-identify with and the one that you function from consciously, so it has your perspective as you walk through the world as a person, but from the shadow there's also another individual that's back there that has just as much of a perspective, is just as much human, has just as many memories, has just as much going on in its world than this part is that comes out in interfaces with everything. And so this puts us in a uniquely interesting position to be able to have integration between those aspects, because you can actually function from that perspective. Now, what I've found oftentimes when somebody has one of these internal schisms is that they can very easily speak from one side of the schism, but the other side of the schism they can only talk about in third person if they're even like aware of that. So if they discover this other part of themselves, they'll say like, oh yeah, this part is like this part is like this, but they'll be taking on this one's perspective still. They have a hard time stepping into this perspective right here, the one that's the shadow. But you can actually put on that persona, put on that self to actually function through like a lens. And you can see what's there. And you can come to know certain aspects of the shadow identity, from taking on this perspective. Also, whenever you integrate the other side of a polarity, what happens is that you end up with the memories of the aspect of that part that were maybe previously repressed, because remember that part has memories, and you end up with the wisdom that it brings to the table too. So it really confers a lot of clarity to have connection to both of these polarities within ourselves. Also, when we experience neuroses, that often comes about because that aspect that's been kept in the shadow has certain unmet needs that it's trying to get met in less than healthy ways. So overall it has a positive intention in that it wants to meet its needs, but it might do so in a way that's against the conscious self's agenda. And so this is why we end up getting scattered with our energy and pulling in other directions, because we have different parts of ourselves that need different things. And so being able to bring things together has a lot to do with reconciling the needs of those parts that are in the shadow with the needs of the parts that are, let's say, possessing the identity or simply existing within the conscious identity. And the thing to realize also with this integration is that there's no way to truly get rid of the other aspect of yourself. It's always functioning there from the shadow, and it finds ways to get out and express itself and to try to go for what it needs and to try to be reintegrated. So basically, if we have an aspect of ourself that we don't like, we might go like, hey, I don't want to integrate that part, I want to get rid of it. Well, it's not really possible to get rid of it. What happens is you can either have that part in your conscious awareness and actually be able to make beneficial decisions from that standpoint and to be able to have more conscious choice over the matter, or it can be down in the shadow where it kind of clandestinely takes control of the personality and finds unhealthy ways to meet its needs and its desires and to have its perspective come through. So it's similar to, let's say, there's an aspect of the shadow that we have labeled as greedy. It's a part that feels very traumatized. Maybe as a child, this part got pushed down into the shadow because it felt like it didn't get its need met in terms of stability of home life, or maybe there was some poverty that was experienced. And so what happened is that part gets pushed down into the shadow, and then it starts to cope through greediness or through obsession with material objects. And so then we go, oh no, this part's the greedy part, so I need to keep that part away, and I need to identify with the non-greedy part. And if I integrate this other aspect, then that means that I'm going to be a super greedy person. But that's not really how it works. So you have to understand that these unhealthy coping mechanisms like greed actually comes from the fact that that aspect has a trauma to it, and it's even traumatic for that part to be pushed down into the shadow. And so the greediness will come out anyway because it's being kept down in the shadow, and that's the way that it ends up expressing its needs and trying to get its needs met. But when we integrate it, what we find is that part is not the greedy part. That part is a wounded aspect of ourself. That part is a part of ourselves that needs healing and needs integration. And whenever we actually do that, we can actually make the coping mechanism of greed obsolete. And in that way, that aspect can become a more exalted form of itself when it's integrated into the conscious awareness. And the greediness goes away, and we start to experience the lighter aspects of that shadow part. Also, because those aspects in the shadow have feelings just like we have feelings, it's sort of like they can feel very put out. So if you reject an aspect of yourself, it feels rejected. And you go through your life feeling like this sense of rejection and this sense of like lack of self-love, and you won't necessarily know where it's coming from. But it comes from cutting away those aspects of ourself and saying, ooh, that part of my natural energy is not valid. And so we come to feel like we are not whole, and we come to feel like there are flaws with us that are just irredeemable, because that's the way those aspects of ourself feel from down in the shadow, and we feel that. Now, when it comes to these internal schisms of opposites, there's always this tension between separation and wholeness. So, when it comes to separation, there's some kind of wedge that comes in between these two polarities that creates the hyper-identification with one aspect and the pushing away of the other aspect. Now, this can come in the form of an emotional wedge in terms of we experience a trauma and our mind-body complex has determined that one aspect of that split is unsafe for us to integrate. So that can be one reason, and so in order to actually have a wholeness happen, you have to remove that barrier. But there can also be other mental barriers, and oftentimes barriers are mental in terms of our beliefs about things and in terms of our worldview. So if we are taught, let's say, that creativity is lesser than pragmatism, and that's what our social group thinks, we're very likely that we are going to identify with pragmatism and say, no, creativity is bad. Let's push that part of the polarity away because that part is bad. So we have this separation happening. But what we also have to understand is that there's an equally strong force of integration happening, and that's always trying to happen. So the state of entropy is for things to move toward wholeness, and it's only the things that separate that keeps that entropy from happening. And so in order to actually have this integration happen, it's not really an active process of bringing those two aspects together. It's a matter of removing whatever the barrier is. So it's sort of like a dam. So if you have a dam and you have all of this water built up here, and then you have a lower level of water over here, in order to make that dam and the water within it reach its level, which is our natural core set point, we just have to remove the dam. The water will naturally seek its level. So in this way, when we are talking about an internal schism of opposites, we're always trying to take away whatever the barrier to entropy is. So when it comes to finding these internal wedges, that when we remove them, these two aspects of ourself just naturally grow back together, we have quite a few different things that we can do. There are many, many processes geared toward this, and I want to go into deeper depth with this in other videos because there's so many different angles you can come at this from. But in this video, I'm going to give you just a quick at-a-glance for what to do so that you can actually start finding these wedges and removing those barriers to integration right now. But again, there's a zillion and two ways to do it. So the first thing to do is to find your judgments toward other people and toward yourself. So when it comes to these wedges, they can happen in the form of thoughts or they can happen in the form of emotions. Those are really the only two mediums that these wedges occur in. So when it comes to the thought medium, judgment is one of the main ways that we maintain these schisms, because a judgment inward always begets a judgment outward and vice versa. So if we see that we are judging another person externally, oftentimes it's that same judgment going on internally. So in this way, if you find your judgments toward other people, and judgments always have to do with identification and disidentification, not necessarily discernment, like, oh, that was not a good thing that that person did, but you see that and you go, oh, that person is a certain way that I don't want to identify myself as. And so I want to push my self-concept as far away from their self as possible. So, for example, if somebody is just a really creative person, you identify with pragmatism, you might go, oh, I don't want to be anything like that person. You find this judgment and you start to explore into it. Think about what that judgment's giving you. Think about what your beliefs are about both of these polarities. And in that way, you can start to dissolve that barrier through understanding, through deepening awareness. You also want to be on the lookout for feelings of superiority or inferiority when it comes to judgment. So if it's serving the God of your identity, generally a judgment is going to be creating this kind of schism, because it's very much an ego-created thing. It's very much identity-laden. So if you see something and you go, oh, that's not right for me, that's not the same thing. But if you say, oh, I'm not like that, I don't want to be anything like that, that's when you really have to look at there being a potential internal schism of opposites happening. Now, once you find this internal schism of opposites and start to understand more about it, what you want to do is you want to reconcile the needs of these two halves. So oftentimes there can be an internal schism of opposites because we believe that if we have this part that we're identified with, that this part is going to somehow undermine its needs from being met. So let's take, for example, somebody who has a split relative to the spectrum of connection with other people. So let's say that the person really identifies as a loner and they feel like emotional connection is inherently unsafe. And so we have this part that needs emotional safety, and it does so by isolating itself, by keeping the person away from people. So it's basically wanting emotional safety, and it feels like emotional safety can't also be had if this other aspect's needs are met. So this other aspect would be the part that actually wants to connect with other people, the part that wants friends, the part that wants to socialize. So this part has a need for connection with others. So what happens is this person has a particular idea or a particular impression, maybe based in past traumas, that you can't have emotional safety and you can't have emotional connection at the same time. They feel at odds. So you want to work toward reconciling those ideas, that you can have both and that you don't have to leave one aspect out in the cold just to honor the needs of the other aspect. And when those aspects see that both of those needs can be met at the same time, there's a lot easier of a time holding space for both of those aspects, because neither one of those aspects are in an antagonistic relationship with one another. Now, there are many ways to find reconciliation between the needs of two aspects. So you can do this through active imagination. That tends to be my preferred method, where basically it's kind of like a shower conversation. I might talk to a certain person that I relate to an aspect of myself, or I might directly talk from the perspective of an aspect in my shadow, and I basically just try to intuitively find resolve between my perspective that I'm taking and the perspective that I'm talking to. And in doing that, it gives me direct access to talking to an aspect of self that would otherwise be unavailable to me, that would otherwise be down in the shadow. And when you are doing active imagination, the idea here is that internally, in the psyche, we have aspects of ourselves that are there, and they wear the masks, so to speak, of other people in our lives, or certain archetypes, or certain characters, or even ourselves in some way. So this internal mask assigning of different aspects of ourselves actually help us directly interact with that part. So for example, let's say that I relate a certain aspect of myself to a parental figure that I have a rough time with. Let's say that there's some like trauma in the past and I've related all of these things to a certain parental figure. And so that part of myself is then wearing the mask of that parental figure. So whenever I talk to my parental figure in active imagination, I'm actually directly talking to that aspect of myself that I've maybe have a contentious relationship with because of the past traumas. So that's the basic idea behind active imagination and why it works. So I highly recommend checking out my video on active imagination for this process. Now, I do have a lot more that I could go into with this topic, but again, I want to keep it concise, I want to keep it short, I want to just basically talk about the mechanism behind it. So be sure to watch out for more videos in the future on this general topic because it is very broad. And of course, shadow work, I already have probably like 10 videos on my channel about it from different perspectives. So there's just as many ways, if not more, to actually resolve these internal schisms and to reconcile the needs and perspectives of those different aspects of self. And in doing that, we end up coming back into our natural center, into our core, the core of our nature. Anyway, that's all I have for you for now. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead, click the like button below and subscribe, and don't forget to hit the notification bell. Also, if you're interested in a shadow work tarot session with me over Skype or Zoom, you can actually click the link down below in the description box or go into the comments section. Now with the shadow work tarot session, my primary focus is to locate the primary shadow aspect and then discover more things about it, what its needs are, what its barriers are to integration, common misconceptions about it, and the like. And so if you want to learn more about yourself and gain more clarity and help gain access to those parts that have been kept down in the shadow, then I highly recommend signing up. And of course, if you have any more questions, you can visit thediamondnet.org for more information, or you can email me at thediamondnetchannel@gmail.com. Anyway, that's all I have for you for now, and until next time, keep becoming more you.